November 1945. The Western Pacific. The steel deck of the USS Iowa rises and falls beneath grey skies, its rhythm synchronized with the endless swells of a sea that has swallowed too many men. The war is over. The silence that follows victory is strange, heavier than the thunder of 16-inch guns, more unsettling than the scream of incoming shells. On this cold morning, the wind carries salt and the faint smell of diesel, but also something unexpected: roasting turkey. The scent drifts across the forecastle, past the gun turrets still warm from recent use, and into the nostrils of prisoners who have known only rice and deprivation for years. They stand in loose formation, Japanese soldiers and sailors, men who weeks ago would have gladly died to sink this very ship. Their uniforms hang loose on frames, carved down to sinew and bone. Some stare at the horizon with eyes that have stopped asking questions. Others glance nervously at the American sailors moving about the deck with a casual confidence that seems, to these prisoners, almost obscene. The war has taught these Japanese men many things about their enemy. That Americans waste ammunition with terrifying abundance, that their machines never stop coming, that their will to fight grows stronger the farther they are from home, but nothing in their training, nothing in the whispered stories of the Bushido Code or the divine destiny of the Empire has prepared them for what is about to happen. An American officer, young, perhaps 24, with the kind of face that belongs in a Kansas wheat field, approaches the prisoners. He speaks through an interpreter, his voice carrying neither triumph nor contempt, only a matter-of-fact directness that the Japanese find more disconcerting than hatred would be. "Today is Thanksgiving," he says. "You will eat with us." The prisoners do not understand. Not yet. To comprehend the shock of this moment, one must first understand the distance these men have travelled not in nautical miles, but in ideology. The Japanese soldiers aboard the Iowa in November 1945 are products of a system that has spent 2 decades reshaping the soul of a nation. Since the Mukden incident of 1931, Japanese military culture has been honed into something resembling a religious faith. The soldier is taught that surrender is worse than death, that the individual exists only as a cell in the body of the emperor, that suffering is the furnace in which the Japanese spirit is purified. This is not mere propaganda, it is the water in which an entire generation has been swimming since childhood. Military rations reflect this philosophy. The standard Japanese field ration consists of rice, perhaps some pickled vegetables, occasionally a small portion of fish or seaweed. During the island campaigns of 1943 and 1944, as American submarines strangle Japan's supply lines, these rations become aspirational fantasies. On Guadalcanal, soldiers boil tree bark. On New Guinea, they eat grass. Medical records captured after the war reveal that the average Japanese soldier in the Pacific theatre loses 30 to 40 pounds during active campaigning. Some units report casualty rates where disease and starvation kill 3 men for every 1 lost to enemy fire. This is accepted. This is expected. The emperor's soldiers do not complain about hunger. To do so would be to admit weakness, to betray the collective, to dishonor ancestors stretching back 1,000 years. The Americans, by contrast, approach warfare like they approach everything else as a problem requiring industrial solutions and logistical excellence. The U.S. military supply chain is a wonder of the modern world, a testament to a nation that has never known invasion, never experienced the desperate arithmetic of rationing, never had to choose between feeding soldiers and feeding children. An American infantry division in the Pacific consumes approximately 650 tons of supplies per day. Of this, food represents a significant fraction. The sea ration, that ubiquitous tin can that becomes the subject of endless soldier complaints, contains more calories and protein than most Japanese soldiers see in 3 days. Each sea ration provides approximately 3,000 calories: meat, vegetables, dessert, cigarettes, even toilet paper. To Japanese soldiers who capture these rations, they are incomprehensible. One Japanese officer's diary, recovered on Saipan, describes finding American supplies. We discovered boxes of food, so much food, chocolate, canned fruit, even chewing gum. What kind of nation feeds its soldiers like this? How can we fight such abundance? The question is more profound than it appears. The food is not simply sustenance, it is a statement of philosophy. American military doctrine holds that a well-fed soldier fights better, thinks more clearly, maintains morale over long campaigns. But deeper than doctrine is an assumption so fundamental that Americans rarely articulate it, that human life has inherent value, that the individual soldier matters, that taking care of one's men is not a luxury but a moral imperative. This assumption is woven into the fabric of a democracy, inseparable from the idea that governments derive their power from the consent of the governed, that citizens are not subjects, that a man's life belongs to himself first and the state second. The Japanese military operates under precisely the opposite assumption. When American forces begin capturing significant numbers of Japanese prisoners in late 1944 and throughout 1945, the cultural collision produces genuine confusion on both sides. The Japanese prisoners expect execution, or, at best, brutal captivity, mirroring the treatment Japan inflicts on Allied POWs. What they receive instead violates every assumption they carry about the nature of war and the relationship between victor and vanquished. The USS Iowa, like other American vessels tasked with transporting prisoners in the war's final months, follows protocols established by the Geneva Convention, a document Japan has never ratified and barely acknowledges. Prisoners are to be housed, fed, and given medical care equivalent to that provided to American personnel. This is not altruism. It is policy grounded in reciprocity and law. But to men who have been taught that surrender is unthinkable and that the defeated forfeit all claims to humanity, the policy appears almost supernatural in its strangeness. The Thanksgiving of 1945 is the first celebrated after victory. For the crew of the Iowa, it is a moment of profound relief. The ship has survived. They have survived. The killing is finally over. The Navy, maintaining traditions that stretch back generations, prepares a feast. In a galley designed to feed a crew of nearly 2,700 men, cooks work around the clock. Turkey, dozens of them, brought from refrigerated holds, each bird weighing 20 pounds or more. Mashed potatoes whipped with real butter and cream. Gravy made from pan drippings. Cranberry sauce, both jellied and wholeberry. Sweet potatoes topped with marshmallows, green beans, dinner rolls with butter, pumpkin pie, apple pie, coffee, milk. The quantities are staggering. The official Navy record indicates that the Iowa serves over 4,000 pounds of turkey that day, along with 1,500 pounds of potatoes, 800 pounds of cranberries, and 600 pies. This is not a special allocation, this is standard. Across the Pacific Fleet, on every vessel from battleships to destroyer escorts, similar feasts unfold. The total cost to feed the Navy on Thanksgiving 1,945 runs into millions of dollars. The logistical chain required to deliver this food, the refrigerated cargo ships, the supply depots, the transportation network spanning half the globe represents an industrial capacity that no other nation on Earth can match. And the prisoners, numbering perhaps 200 aboard the Iowa, are told they will eat the same meal as their captors. The interpreter explains the tradition of Thanksgiving, a harvest festival, a day of gratitude, a moment when Americans pause to acknowledge abundance and fortune. The Japanese prisoners listen with faces that betray nothing. Internally, many experience something close to cognitive dissonance. The concept of a national holiday dedicated to gratitude for food surplus exists in a universe so distant from their experience that it might as well be fiction. Japan has no such tradition, not because the Japanese are ungrateful, but because for centuries abundance has been rare, something hoped for but never assumed. The Japanese relationship with food is governed by scarcity, by the understanding that the rice bowl is never guaranteed, that the harvest can fail, that hunger is always one bad season away. When the meal is served, the prisoners are directed to tables set up on deck. They file through a serving line, another American innovation that strikes the Japanese as bizarre in its efficiency and egalitarianism. Officers and enlisted men eat the same food, in the same quantities, from the same line. Rank affords no special privilege here. An American sailor slaps a portion of turkey onto each plate, not a thin slice but a thick slab, enough meat for 3 meals by Japanese standards. Potatoes, steaming and glistening with butter. Vegetables. Bread. Dessert. One prisoner, a former sergeant in the Imperial Army captured on Okinawa, will later describe this moment in an interview conducted decades after the war. "I thought they were mocking us. I thought this was some elaborate torture to show us food and then take it away, or perhaps to poison us. It made no sense otherwise. Why would they waste such food on prisoners? We were defeated. We had failed the emperor. We deserved nothing. But no one takes the food away. No one watches with cruel amusement as the prisoners eat. In fact, the American sailors largely ignore them, absorbed in their own celebrations, their own conversations about home and family and the futures they will return to. This indifference is perhaps more shocking than the food itself. The prisoners are irrelevant, not hated, not feared, simply no longer significant. The war is over. The Americans have already moved on. The prisoners eat slowly at first, suspicious. The turkey is unlike anything most of them have tasted, rich, fatty, almost overwhelming after months or years of starvation rations. Some find their stomachs rebel after years of deprivation. They eat small amounts and save the rest, unable to believe that more will be offered. But more is offered. Sailors moving through the ranks ask if anyone wants seconds. Some prisoners accept. One begins to weep quietly, though whether from gratitude, shame, or the sheer psychological weight of the experience, no one can say. An American chaplain moves among the tables, speaking through an interpreter. He explains that Thanksgiving is a time to recognize common humanity, to give thanks for life and peace. He does not proselytize aggressively the American military. In 1945 takes its separation of church and state seriously, even in spiritual matters, but his presence, his gentle demeanor, confuses the prisoners further. Where is the hatred? Where is the vengeance? Japanese propaganda has spent years describing Americans as demons, as subhuman barbarians who torture and mutilate prisoners. Yet here is a holy man, offering blessings to the defeated. The cognitive dissonance deepens. The assumptions that have structured these men's entire adult lives are cracking. To understand why this meal carries such weight, one must examine what Japanese soldiers expected from their American captors. The expectation is shaped entirely by projection. Japan treats captured Americans with unspeakable brutality. Therefore, Americans must intend the same. The Bataan Death March, the Sandakan Death Marches, the countless documented instances of torture, starvation, and execution of POWs create a framework through which Japanese soldiers interpret the world. If our treatment of them is righteous and necessary, their treatment of us must be equally harsh. This is the logic of total war, of ideological struggle, of a conflict framed not as a dispute over territory, but as a cosmic battle between incompatible civilizations. But the American military, for all its flaws and occasional atrocities, operates under different principles. The United States has ratified the Geneva Convention. American commanders, at least officially, are bound by its provisions. More importantly, the American self-image as liberators, as defenders of freedom and human dignity, requires a certain level of ethical conduct. This is not always honored in practice. The Pacific War is brutal, and men in combat commit acts they would never commit in civilian life. But at the institutional level, at the level of policy and military justice, there is a line. Prisoners are to be treated humanely. Medical care is to be provided. Food is to be sufficient. These are not suggestions. They are orders. Japanese prisoners, arriving at camps or aboard ships, find themselves in a bizarre inversion of expectations. They are fed. They are given clean clothing. They are allowed to bathe. Medical officers treat their wounds and infections without regard to their status as enemy combatants. Interrogations are professional, rarely brutal. No one executes them for sport. No one withholds food as punishment. The camps are not luxurious barbed wire, and guards are present, but compared to what these men expected, compared to what they would have received in Japanese custody, the conditions are bewildering. The Thanksgiving meal aboard the Iowa encapsulates this inversion. The prisoners sit at tables, eating food prepared with care, surrounded by enemy sailors who laugh and talk among themselves without paying the defeated much attention. The meal is not a gift meant to humiliate through generosity. It is simply standard procedure, the ordinary expression of a culture that believes abundance is normal, that feeding people well is an obvious baseline, that even enemies retain some fundamental dignity. For men raised in the ideology of Bushido, where suffering is virtue and deprivation is discipline, the meal is almost obscene. There is something shameful, from their perspective, in eating so well, especially after defeat, especially when comrades have died hungry. One prisoner will later write, "I felt I was betraying the men who starved on Guadalcanal. How could I sit eating turkey when they ate nothing? But I was so hungry, I could not stop eating. The shame and the hunger fought inside me." This internal conflict, the collision between indoctrinated values and physical reality, begins to erode the ideological certainty that has sustained these men through years of war. If the Americans are demons, why do they feed us? If we are honorable and they are barbaric, why do they treat us better than our own officers did? The questions have no good answers within the framework of Japanese wartime ideology. The framework itself must shift, must crack, must eventually shatter. The symbolism of the Thanksgiving meal extends beyond mere sustenance. Every element of the dinner carries meaning, though the American sailors serving it are largely unconscious of the message they send. The turkey, that quintessentially American bird, represents the New World's agricultural bounty, a continent so rich in resources that a single farm can produce surplus beyond imagination. The side dishes, each one abundant, speak to a food culture where variety is expected, where meals contain not just calories but pleasure, color, texture, choice. The cranberries, tart and sweet simultaneously, come from Massachusetts bogs, harvested by workers who will return home each night to heated houses with electric lights. The potatoes, mashed, smooth and whipped with dairy, require not just the crop itself but the infrastructure to deliver milk from Wisconsin, butter from Iowa, all kept fresh in refrigerated transport. The pumpkin pies, those icons of American domesticity, require sugar and ingredient rationed in Japan, nearly unobtainable, here distributed freely even to prisoners. Each component of the meal is a small testament to industrial agriculture, to transportation networks, to an economy so vast and efficient that feeding a navy numbering hundreds of thousands men poses no insurmountable challenge. But beyond the material facts lies something more intangible, the ritual itself. Thanksgiving is a civilian holiday, a family holiday, now transplanted to a warship and extended even to enemies. The inclusivity of the gesture that prisoners eat the same meal as their guards expresses a democratic impulse. We are all, the meal suggests, humans deserving of basic dignity. The war is over. You were our enemy, but you are not our enemy now. You are simply men, far from home, and today we eat together. This is not a message the Japanese prisoners are prepared to receive. Their conception of the enemy is binary. One is either strong or weak, victor or vanquished, worthy or contemptible. The idea that one can be defeated yet still retain dignity, that one's captor might extend respect without demanding abasement, exists outside the ideological vocabulary they have been taught. The meal forces them to confront a different model of human relations, one where power does not demand total submission, where victory does not require humiliation of the defeated. An American officer, watching the prisoners eat, remarks to a subordinate, "Strange, isn't it? 2 months ago, we'd have killed them without a second thought. Now we're feeding them pumpkin pie." The subordinate, a young ensign from Maine, shrugs. "War's over, sir. No point being cruel now." This exchange, casual and unremarkable to the Americans, would be incomprehensible to Japanese officers schooled in the warrior ethic. The idea that cruelty requires justification, that its appropriateness depends on context, that one turns it off when circumstances change this pragmatism, this absence of absolute codes, is profoundly alien. Yet it is precisely this flexibility, this willingness to shift from enemy to neutral to potential ally, that will define the post-war order. The Americans are already thinking ahead, already planning the occupation of Japan, already recognizing that today's defeated foe might be tomorrow's partner. The Thanksgiving meal is not policy. No one has drafted a memo declaring that feeding prisoners turkey will advance strategic objectives. But in its small way, the meal prefigures the Marshall Plan, the rebuilding of Europe and Japan, the entire project of constructive peace that will distinguish the American occupation from the punitive approach taken after the First World War. The prisoners do not yet understand that they are witnessing a preview of their nation's future. They know only that the turkey is rich, the pie is sweet, and nothing makes sense anymore. As the meal concludes and the prisoners are escorted back to their holding areas below deck, conversations begin to ripple through their ranks. Men who have barely spoken since capture find their voices. They compare experiences, searching for explanations. Some cling to suspicion. It is a trick. They fatten us for some purpose we cannot see. Others begin to question everything they have been told. If they lied about the Americans being barbarians, what else was a lie? One former naval officer, a graduate of the Imperial Japanese Naval Academy at Etajima, sits alone, staring at his hands. He has eaten more in one meal than he consumed in the last week of combat on Leyte Gulf. Before the war, he studied English, read American technical journals, admired the U.S. Navy's professionalism. Then came Pearl Harbor, and the certainty that Japan's spiritual superiority would overcome material disadvantage. 4 years later, his fleet is gone, his emperor has surrendered, and he is a prisoner eating turkey. The English lessons from his youth return to him now. He remembers reading about American Thanksgiving in a textbook. It seemed then like propaganda, a fantasy of abundance. Now he understands it was simple truth. The psychological transformation underway in these men is not immediate. Years of indoctrination cannot be erased by a single meal. But seeds of doubt have been planted. The absolute certainty required to function within a totalitarian military system begins to erode. If the enemy is not as described, if the world is not as simple as the slogans suggest, then perhaps everything is more complicated. Perhaps individual judgment matters. Perhaps authority can be questioned. These are dangerous thoughts for men raised in the imperial system, thoughts that, had they surfaced during the war, would have been crushed by military police. But the war is over. The system has failed. The emperor has spoken on the radio, admitting defeat. The old certainties are gone. In the weeks and months that follow, as these prisoners are processed through camps and eventually repatriated to Japan, many will carry memories of the Thanksgiving meal as a pivotal moment. In interviews conducted decades later, survivors speak of it with a mixture of wonder and embarrassment. "We were so shocked," one recalls, "not just by the food, but by the casualness of it. They treated it as normal. That was what we could not understand, that feeding even enemies so well was just normal to them." This normalization of abundance, this assumption that plenty is the natural state of affairs, is perhaps the deepest difference between the American and Japanese worldviews in 1945. Japan has spent centuries managing scarcity of land, of resources, of food. The entire imperial project, the drive for conquest across Asia, is motivated by a hunger for resources, by the fear of insufficiency. The propaganda justifying expansion speaks of Japan's need for living space, for oil, for the resources denied by Anglo-American sanctions. Scarcity is the baseline. Abundance is what must be seized from others. America, by contrast, has known little but abundance since its founding. The continent itself is a cornucopia, vast farmlands, endless forests, mineral wealth beyond calculation. The American character is shaped by this geography. There is always more land over the horizon, always another opportunity, always the sense that limits are temporary inconveniences rather than fundamental constraints. This shapes a psychology of optimism, of generosity even, born from the assumption that the pie can always grow larger, that prosperity is not zero-sum. The Thanksgiving meal aboard the Iowa is a microcosm of this larger truth. The Americans feed their prisoners, not because they are saints, they are not, but because waste is easier than rationing, because the supply chain can deliver more than enough, because generosity costs them nothing. To the Japanese, this is miraculous. To the Americans, it is Tuesday. In the years following the war, Japan will undergo perhaps the most dramatic transformation of any defeated nation in history. The American occupation, led by General Douglas MacArthur, will dismantle the militarist regime, purge ultranationalist leaders, impose a new constitution, and rebuild the economy. But beneath the formal policies and institutional changes, a quieter transformation will occur in the hearts and minds of ordinary Japanese. The returning prisoners, numbering in the hundreds of thousands by war's end, bring with them stories. Stories of American camps where prisoners were fed adequately, where Red Cross packages were distributed, where guards, while watchful, were rarely cruel. Stories of abundance so extreme it seemed obscene. Warehouses full of food, clothing distributed freely, medicine available without limit. These stories contrast sharply with the experiences of Japanese civilians who have endured years of rationing, firebombing, starvation. The cognitive dissonance is national in scope. The Thanksgiving meals served aboard ships like the Iowa become legend, small episodes that grow in the telling. The Americans fed us turkey. Men tell their families. Turkey! Like a festival. And they ate the same food. We were prisoners, and they gave us turkey. The repetition of these stories, the wonder in the voices of men who have seen the worst of war, begins to reshape the national understanding of what happened and why Japan lost. It was not, these stories suggest, merely a matter of military might, though American military power was overwhelming. It was not simply industrial capacity, though American factories outproduced Japan by ratios of 10-1 or more. It was something deeper, a fundamentally different approach to human value, to the relationship between the individual and the state, to the purpose of governance itself. The Americans could afford to feed their prisoners well because they had built a society that generated enormous surplus. They chose to feed their prisoners well because their value system, for all its contradictions and failures, held that human life possessed inherent worth. This lesson, absorbed slowly and incompletely, will shape post-war Japan profoundly. The new constitution, imposed by America but eventually embraced by the Japanese people, enshrines principles of democracy, individual rights, and the subordination of the military to civilian control. The economic miracle of the 1,950 seconds through the 1,980 seconds will be built on principles learned, in part, from observing American methods, mass production, efficiency, the belief that prosperity benefits everyone, that a rising tide can lift all boats. The adversarial relationship gives way to alliance, former enemies become partners, and Japan transforms from militarist empire to peaceful economic power. The men who ate turkey aboard the Iowa will live to see this transformation. Some will become teachers, businessmen, fathers who tell their children that war is futile, that cooperation produces better outcomes than conquest. One former prisoner, interviewed in the 1,980 seconds, will work for a Japanese company establishing factories in the American Midwest. He will eat Thanksgiving dinner with American colleagues, and the memory of that first meal at sea will return to him. I did not understand then, he will say, but I understand now. They were showing us a different way to be. We were too blind to see it at the time. The symbolism of the Thanksgiving meal extends into the decades that follow. In the immediate post-war period, American food aid to defeated Japan will stave off mass starvation. Wheat and powdered milk, delivered under the Garioa program, will feed millions. Japanese children will grow up drinking American milk, eating American bread, their palates and bodies shaped by a generosity that seems, from the perspective of recent enemies, almost incomprehensible. This food aid is not charity. It serves American strategic interests, prevents the kind of chaos that might invite communist revolution, but its effects are real. Hunger is averted. Children survive. A generation grows up with reason to see America not as demon but as benefactor. The cultural impact is subtler, but no less profound. Japanese society, confronted with the reality of American abundance, begins to question the narratives that led to war. If the Americans are so wealthy, so powerful, why did Japan's leaders claim victory was possible? If the enemy possesses both military might and ethical restraint, what does that say about the ideology that cast them as subhuman? The questions metastasize, undermining the legitimacy of the old regime, creating space for new ideas. Food becomes a recurring motif in this reassessment. Returned prisoners speak of American rations, C rations, K rations, the infamous spam that American soldiers complain about, but which seems like luxury to men who survived on rice and hope. They speak of mess halls where food is abundant, where men can eat until satisfied, where waste is common. This waste, which Americans take for granted, astonishes the Japanese. The idea that one can afford to throw away food, that surplus is so routine that efficiency is secondary to convenience. This is economic power of a kind Japan has never known. The contrast shapes policy. Post-war Japanese leaders, observing American methods, prioritize agricultural reform, land redistribution, to create a class of small farmers, investment in food production. The goal is not just to feed the population, but to eliminate the spectre of hunger that has haunted Japanese history. Within 2 decades, Japan will achieve food security. Within 4 decades, Japanese cuisine will be celebrated globally, the nation exporting culinary culture rather than importing calories. The transformation is staggering from starvation in 1945 to abundance by 1980, but the memory of hunger persists. The generation that survived the war carries it like a scar. They teach their children not to waste food, to respect the rice bowl, to remember that plenty is not guaranteed. These lessons coexist with the new reality of abundance, creating a uniquely Japanese approach to food, grateful, meticulous, reverent, even in the midst of prosperity. The Thanksgiving turkey, symbol of American plenty, becomes a distant reference point, a reminder of the day the old worldview shattered. In the broader sweep of history, the Thanksgiving meal aboard the Iowa is a footnote, an anecdote, a small human moment amid the vast machinery of war and peace. No treaty was signed over that turkey dinner. No strategic decision turned on whether prisoners received pumpkin pie. Yet the event carries weight precisely because it is ordinary, because it reveals truths that grand narratives often obscure. The meal demonstrates that culture is destiny. The Americans fed their prisoners well, not because they were uniquely virtuous. American racism, segregation, and imperialism were real, but because their culture had developed institutions and assumptions that treated abundance as normal and human dignity as baseline. Japanese soldiers starved not because their culture was uniquely cruel. Japanese art, literature, and philosophy contain profound beauty, but because their institutions had evolved under conditions of scarcity, where suffering was normalized and individual life was subordinated to collective survival. The clash of these cultures in the Pacific War was not just a military conflict, but a collision of worldviews. And in that collision, certain truths emerged. Societies that value individual life tend to produce surplus, because surplus keeps individuals alive. Societies that generate surplus can afford generosity, because they are not locked in zero-sum competition for scarce resources. Generosity, even to enemies, can be strategically wise, because today's enemy may be tomorrow's partner. These lessons, learned in blood across thousands of miles of ocean, would shape the post-war order. The prisoners eating turkey aboard the Iowa in November 1945 are witnesses to a transition. They are the last Japanese soldiers to face America as an enemy, and the first to experience America as something else, not yet friend, not quite ally, but no longer the demon of propaganda. The meal is a threshold, a crossing from one world to another. Behind them lies the ideology of total war, of death before surrender, of national destiny achieved through conquest. Ahead lies something they cannot yet imagine: peace, prosperity, partnership with former enemies. As the Iowa steams toward port, carrying its cargo of prisoners toward processing camps and eventual repatriation, the men below deck struggle to process what they have experienced. Some will cling to the old beliefs, unable or unwilling to acknowledge that their sacrifice was for a lie. Others will begin the painful work of reassessment, questioning everything they thought they knew. A few, prescient or simply adaptable, will already be thinking ahead, wondering what place they will have in the Japan that must be built from the ruins of the Japan they served. The turkey they ate will remain, for all of them, a strange memory, the day abundance confronted scarcity, the moment when the enemy revealed himself as something other than enemy. In the decades to come, as Japan rebuilds and transforms, as former enemies become allies and partners, the Thanksgiving meal will recede into the background, one small story among millions. But for the men who were there, the taste of that turkey will never fully fade, rich and strange, sweet and disturbing, the flavor of a world they did not know existed, the first taste of peace. November 1945, the Western Pacific. The USS Iowa cuts through grey waters, leaving a white wake that dissolves into the immensity of the ocean. Above deck, sailors secure equipment, write letters home, dream of discharge and the civilian lives waiting for them. Below, prisoners rest in holds that are crowded but adequate, guarded but not brutal. The war is over, the future is uncertain. But today, this day, all of them, victor and vanquished, guard and prisoner, American and Japanese, have eaten the same meal. Today, for a few hours, the distinctions that mattered so much have been, if not erased, at least softened. The symbolism will be debated by historians in years to come. Some will see the Thanksgiving meal as propaganda, a calculated gesture designed to demonstrate American superiority. Others will see it as simple humanity, the natural expression of a culture that had internalized certain liberal values. Perhaps it was both. Perhaps it was neither. Perhaps it was simply what happened when men who had been raised in abundance met men who had been raised in scarcity, and the former could not imagine doing otherwise than sharing what they had. But for the prisoners, the debate is irrelevant. They know only what they tasted, what they saw, what they felt. They know that they expected death or torture and received turkey. They know that the enemy was not as described. They know that their understanding of the world, of their place in it, of the truth they had been told and the lies they had believed, has been fundamentally challenged. Some will reject the challenge, clinging to familiar certainties even in the face of evidence. Others will accept it, beginning the long process of rebuilding identity and belief on a new foundation. In the end, perhaps that is the true legacy of the Thanksgiving meal aboard the Iowa, not as a political statement or strategic gesture, but as a human moment that forced reconsideration. War is absolutes. It requires enemies to be enemies, wholly and without nuance. Peace requires something more difficult, the recognition that enemies are human, that yesterday's foe might be tomorrow's neighbor, that the categories we use to divide the world are provisional and subject to change. The men who ate turkey that November day in 1945 will carry the memory into a new era. Some will speak of it often, using it to illustrate lessons to their children about the futility of hate and the possibility of reconciliation. Others will rarely mention it, the memory too complex, too laden with shame and relief and confusion. But all will remember, and in remembering, in carrying that small piece of history forward, they will be part of the larger story of how enemies became allies, how war gave way to peace, how the world, slowly and imperfectly, learned to imagine a different kind of future. The Iowa disappears over the horizon, bound for port and the work of peace. The ocean closes behind it, indifferent to human drama, as it has closed behind every ship since the first vessel set sail. But the men aboard all of them, in different ways, have been changed. The war is over, the meal is finished, but the taste remains, strange and indelible, a reminder that the world is larger and stranger than ideology allows, that abundance and scarcity shape not just economies but souls, and that sometimes, in the space between enemy and friend, there is room for something unexpected, A moment of shared humanity, a turkey dinner, a glimpse of what peace might become. The scent of roasting turkey fades into memory. The prisoners will be repatriated. The sailors will go home. The Iowa will serve again in Korea, in the Cold War, eventually becoming a museum ship, its decks walked by tourists who cannot imagine the history it carries. But for one November day, in 1945, on grey waters beneath grey skies, the war ended not with a treaty or a surrender, but with a meal simple, abundant, bewildering, a taste of a world these men were only beginning to understand. And in that understanding, tentative and incomplete as it was, lay the seeds of everything that would follow.